buttons and scroll wheels. That's always maddening,
Yeah.
On a computer, you just drop down boxes.
Yeah, right. It'll play music, but you may be losing certain feature sets that you were expecting. Like
In the old days, it was almost easier.
I remember back in the day when the video formats were changing, and originally way back, you go back, and there was one single coaxial cable for video, right? It was they called it composite video.
Yeah.
The
yellow wire.
Yeah.
Yellow, white, red.
Wasn't marked yellow. Yeah. Well, in that case, yeah. Well, so the white and red were left and right audio. So you'd have left, right channel and a video cable. And I guess, I don't know what you'd be hooking up with this, maybe out of your old school VCR or
something like that.
Old camcorder, one where you had to turn the wheel to make it.
Oh, no.
I think it was a little before that.
Yeah. We were just doing that before. You're like, how do you do how do you tell somebody that you're recording video,
Not like that.
Yeah,
Well, now it would be like.
No one would get that. Who would get that?
Yeah, well,
we were trying to figure out, well, how would you symbolize that let's go do a video. We couldn't figure anything out. Other than let's go. But anyway, we wanted to talk a little bit about cabling and the wild west that it is. It's very confusing. I remember, when we went from composite to component video, and I mean, I wasn't into video at the time. We were audio guys. We have speaker cable, we have interconnect, right? And you start looking at these video formats for hooking stuff up in the home environment and stuff, and component. All of a sudden, now there were 3 coaxial cables to get picture, and it's like, whoa! You went from 1 to 3.
Well, and that's video. I don't know if that came before component.
Yes, video lasted for like 3 years, it seems.
Yeah, well, the plug, those mini plugs they used sucked. Everyone was busting pins on them.
Yeah,
because you couldn't see where you were
right.
plugging
It's
them
always
in.
like, I can't see behind this VCR.
Yeah, and it just stink, and the pin fell out, and the cable was shot, and but S video is actually, well, there were 4 pins, 4 wires. I don't know what they did with it. They ran.
I think it was basically composite or component in a single cable.
Yeah,
the thought was to make it the best of both.
I think it was a different format, but
well, it might have been a different format, but it probably was similar enough to that because
they broke out. I think they separated chrominance and luminance, but anyway, who cares?
Yeah. Sounds believable.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. But it definitely had better picture quality than the composite, which just
no doubt.
When things started getting better and you went away from your 5-inch black and white sets to something real with resolution on the screen.
But we're talking about audio.
Yeah, well, I'm getting there.
Okay.
So anyway, bottom line is that so now you went to component, and then now you had composite component as video. Now people are confused as hell, right? Because what cable do I get? I got this TV and I got this thing I want to hook up to it, and no one knew what the hell they get. They just didn't know. I just didn't know. It was.
Well, it actually is more complicated because some TVs had components, some didn't.
Right.
So then it's like, oh, well, what TV do you have? Well, I don't know.
Well, it made it almost impossible to plan ahead.
Yeah.
Because until you had it in front of you, I mean, we're going back where our internet was young too. You couldn't just pull up an owner's manual on the internet and say, oh, there's the back panel. Show a picture of back
availability of information.
You had to have it in front of you. So okay, first you buy the stuff, then you figure out what cable to get for it. It was a process, And then it's not like you had eBay either or Amazon where you go just order the cable. You had to physically go to a store and buy the cable.
Radio Shack.
Yeah, right. Yeah, which is now gone. Yeah. Anyway, okay, so not enough history.
Yeah.
Audio is kind of like that too. We're running into the same gambit of cabling.
It's kind of in that range.
It's
It's early days.
There's one more step though, HDMI then.
What?
Because in video. Because then the back receivers who had all those things on them, and now they're just they got 7 HDMI ports on the back of the receiver, and it cleaned
you remember
it all
how
up.
many they used to have? It would have the component, the composite, the S video even.
Yeah.
Sometimes 2 component outs.
And in the early days of HDMI 2 also.
Yeah.
So it was just massive.
But now
connectors.
it all got replaced basically with HDMI.
Right. So in video, we kind of sorted it out.
Sort of, yeah.
Someone came out with a standard that
Took
works.
20 years.
Yeah.
30
Now, the
years?
problem with doing that is then they had to keep revising the HDMI standard as things progressed. But that's a different problem.
Yeah.
Well, audio seems to be a bit like that today. When you're talking about digital audio, you try to connect a DAC to a source, a DAP, or a computer or something like that. You typically have options, multiple options. And there's pros and cons and technicalities to each, but for the most part, they all kind of work. So it makes it more difficult, if anything, because then the question is, which one do you use? Which one's best? Is there a difference? Does it even matter?
Yeah, and I mean, HDMI, like we said, is pretty much taken over. So you'll see in video and home theater is kind of combined in that. If you have used just a receiver, it pretty much is all just going to have HDMI. Might have a composite or
They still
component
put them
input,
in, yeah.
just for shits and giggles, in case you got something old you want to hook up to it. Receivers have 100 connectors on the back, but in the more higher end things, you are usually limited to a few. But that's not true either, because now DACs, like you look at the back panel, even
Some of them are
Yeah.
really cluttered.
they're full of connectors.
58 different connectors.
You know, and if you're new at this, like I get this question once in a while, people are like, "Well, what do I need for a cable?" Because it's like the old days of the video.
Yeah, how do you
You
know?
don't know where to begin.
Yeah.
You don't know. I mean, okay, so if I get one and connects to this connector and it connects to that connector, will I actually hear music? It's a good question. Maybe, maybe not.
I think we're kind of in a weird stage right now because everything will work and it'll serve the task. There are some typically data rate limitations, so maybe you won't get the highest bit rate, the highest quality sent from your computer or your DAP or whatever to the device if you use the wrong connector. But generally, that isn't really that big of a factor. It seems most people are using USB because they know it, which is
Right.
kind of a pro and a con. It works fine, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best connector. But
Not all the time.
we seem to be relying on it because everybody has it, they use it, they're familiar with it.
It's universal.
Oh, is it now? Is it also a serial bus?
Yeah, well, the cool thing about USB, like particularly in the higher end of audio, is that it will usually can handle all data rates. So that telling somebody, okay, you want to use USB, I mean, for the most part, you're going to be able to play at the highest data rate that's the system's capable of. And the cons of that is that's dependent on what you're using it with.
System compatibility.
There are drivers, software drivers that might have to be in a PC to be able to get, if you're using a PC for a source. You know, in the higher end of things, usually this stuff is all sorted out for you. You know, because you're not running a computer, you're running well, I don't know what you'd be running, a phone,
Could be a phone.
yeah, an iPad. But even then, you've got iOS devices, and you've got Android. They run different adapter cables, right? So that gets confusing.
Well, it depends on whether or not they wanted to use the standardized interfaces. Because it turns out there is a standardized protocol for sending audio over USB. It isn't always used and implemented properly, so sometimes you have issues. Sometimes you need to install a driver. Other times, a driver is installed seamlessly in the background. And that's kind of the messy thing. It seems now most things you plug them in, they work over USB, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you have drivers that are required to enhance the features or the capabilities of the device. If you have two-way communications or something, some controls on the thing.
Yeah, right. It'll play music, but you may be losing certain feature sets that you were expecting, like, you know, whatever. I don't know what. Depends on what the software was made to do.
Some of the stuff does a ton of different things in
Yeah.
addition to
Well, and-
regular audio.
It's a lot easier to use usually instead of like going through menus with like buttons and scroll wheels. That's always maddening, you know.
Yeah.
On a computer, just drop down boxes. You know?
Yeah, well, if you know where those drop-down boxes
Well,
are.
I find
you-
it easier.
You have to assume some people aren't savvy with the computers either, so it gets difficult.
That's kind of the factor, though, right? Because if you're looking at a general recommendation, somebody knows nothing, they want to plug it in and work. In the old days, it was almost easier because you could say, oh, you just plug in your yellow cable to the yellow plug.
Yeah, right.
You have video. Now it's kind of like, well, what computer are you using? How are you using it?
Yeah.
And sometimes you even have issues with certain USB ports on your computer in some cases. There's different types of ports, many different types and formats of USB these days. And sometimes there's issues with certain ones being used for audio in certain situations.
Yeah.
Because now there's like 14 different USB standards and it's very unclear which one's what.
So unfortunately, we don't have a way in a simple video to define what USB cable you need to hook up where and what drivers you need, because that's a variable depending on.
Plug it in, see if it works.
Yeah,
There's a
that's
start.
a good start.
Because
yeah.
usually it'll probably work.
Well, and read the owner's manual too. I mean, I hate to say that, but it's true. Is take a look at. I mean, usually at the beginning of the instructions, the first things they're showing you is, other than turning it on and putting an AC power on it, right, is how to connect it. And of course, if you have 10 different options there, that's going to blow your mind. But USB for audio is probably the safest bet. I'm not saying it's the best thing possible ever in the world
Yeah.
for high-res music, but it'll almost always get you high-res out of the system. You know what I mean? Without having to think too hard about it. I'll figure out till I'll figure it out. It's unfortunately the most universal thing we have.
right now.
Yeah.
I know my last motherboard, it had a USB port that wouldn't work. It kept crashing when I plugged my DAC into it.
Yeah.
Plugged into another one, it works. So
Yeah.
that is a thing.
Shitty motherboard.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, there's different chipsets and stuff behind these different ports. Sometimes you'll see especially on high-end computers now, they'll have different colored USB ports, and sometimes they're labeled differently. But the standards are kind of messy and changing all the time still, so it's kind of difficult to make a general sweeping recommendation to somebody, and that's part of the issue with USB. Usually it works fine.
And it's funny, it's too bad that for whatever reason HDMI isn't really, even though it's used a lot in the consumer world, hooking TVs and receivers and stuff up, it's pretty seamless nowadays. But for whatever reason, that never got integrated into the high-end 2-channel. There's just, I don't know what, there's just too many rules, handshaking, resolution limitations that the studios don't want you to have full res. Everything has to communicate with each other. We're in high-end, you have a tube preamp. There's nothing there to communicate with.
Yeah.
All right, it's just, I'm just saying, so you can't go HDMI into a tube, any type of the higher end audio stuff, because it's not designed with that subset of electronics that are capable of handling it properly. Where you just kind of need a receiver, which is too bad because anyway, that's a whole different process. Bottom line is that it just depends. There's no good answer.
No, unfortunately there isn't.
Yeah.
It would be nice if we had a standard that was universal, that just worked. But right now we kind of don't. It seems like it's still evolving because there's a few DACs that are moving towards Ethernet, and everything still pretty much has optical, it seems, oddly enough. That standard never really took off, but it's still on so many products. And it has its benefits, I suppose, but you don't see a lot of people using it.
Well, they got rid of the Apple TV. They got rid of the optical out.
Yeah, it has HDMI only now.
That's it. Yeah, so they narrowed that down.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
you
now
can still find motherboards with optical. Still,
Yeah.
quite a few DACs have optical.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I looked. I didn't even know my motherboard, that new one, has it.
Huh.
I'm like, I don't think it does. And I looked, actually.
Yeah, 2022, and they're still
There-
shipping motherboards. with
There's
it.
optical outputs on most of today's TV sets, the flat
Yep.
screen. So you could come optical out of a TV and come into a DAC or a receiver with optical. And actually, I prefer optical for televisions because TVs are noisy devices. They generate a lot of hash and just weird noise that if you hook a wire up to it, the noise travels down the wire and gets in everything
Electrical
else.
noise.
Yeah. So with optical, there's no wire. It's optical. It's a fiber. It's plastic or glass, right?
Well,
So-
that is mainly the only way people usually use audio in HDMI is with TVs, with ARC and everything, eARC now.
yeah.
So that's an audio return channel.
Right.
So you're running audio over HDMI.
And by all means, with a TV, that's pretty much what you're going to run.
It's easy.
It's the only way you're going to
You
get
just-
the res out of the TV.
Yeah, it's pretty much all you got now.
But if you're trying to get audio out of the TV, like optical's a good way to go to hook up to a subs. Like I've got my TV hooked up to the headphone system and the 2-channel
Mhm.
with a 25-foot optical cable. And that's another thing, too. You can run a 25-foot optical
Yeah.
cable because it's just light and probably isn't going to have an issue with it. You can probably run 50 feet. It's never an issue. But your
Wow.
resolution only is limited, might be limited to like 48K, something like that. It's not going to give you the res of HDMI, but it gives you audio, and it doesn't sound bad. And, it's decoded audio, the TV, whatever you're watching, it's there.
Well, yeah,
So-
it won't get degraded. It'll just not work.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So, I don't know. I mean, that's about it. I mean, it's
Well,
really,
we could talk about the newer interfaces, I2S over HDMI.
yeah. Some companies use that.
That's a
Not many.
emerging standard, sort of, but it's kind of not a standard, which is the
Yeah.
issue yet again.
Yeah, because we've had a couple people ask me that, like with the Saga, because it has I2S in, and it's an HDMI connector. And, like, what's the pinout? They want the pinout is to tell. They're trying to figure out if it's equivalent to whatever the hell they're trying to connect it to at the other end.
Yeah.
And there's no standard. They're just kind of frigging it and using I2S as
It works, but
because
it's a non-standard
There's a lot of
implementation.
wires in an I2 in a HDMI cable, so it gives them all the wire they need to hook these things up. Just a question of how they connected at each end in the units themselves. It's crazy.
The hope is in time we'll see an interface that is optimized for high-end audio, and somebody develops a standard and people actually use it. But right now, pretty much use USB if you're working off a computer, because you don't have a lot of options. It's either that or optical, and USB probably is the preferred method for most DACs.
If you're worried about resolution,
Yep.
if noise is an issue and you don't need to have maximize your resolution, optical is great because again, you're isolating the computer from the
Right.
You know, if you
Optical
just
works.
general use, optical's pretty easy if you have it,
Usually
know,
very reliable.
and there's nothing to think about. It's going to work.
Yeah.
You know, there's no drivers, there's no
Yeah.
software.
Optical is kind of like the yellow video cable of
the
audio
composite
now.
video.
You know, it's
audio.
just like you
Yeah.
plug it in, it pretty much works.
Right.
So it's nice in that regard.
Yeah.
But it does have some limitations. For the most part, they're really not severe, and it works fine. So it's a viable option. But the Ethernet options also a little messy right now. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there's a well-developed standard that everybody settled on, so you don't see the connector being put on a lot of things, and sometimes it's not. A lot of times it seems like in high-end audio, people are just using the cables as a conductor, and they're not using like a standard interface. So sometimes you plug it into a different brand and it doesn't work properly, and that's a bit of an issue.
Well, I ran into recently, a couple of weeks ago, a situation where my only option was to run HDMI audio. No other option. Yeah. Coming out of my 4K Blu-ray player, I had to run independent HDMI only audio through my receiver, because if I went through the receiver and then went out the receiver to my projector, it wouldn't have enough. It didn't pass through the HDR. It would be 4K, but it didn't have the
Your
the
receiver
new
was
stand. It was a
limiting
couple
the-
years old.
Yeah, your receiver was
Yeah.
was limiting the bandwidth.
Yeah, so I had to
Yeah.
bypass it, send
So
video
you
to the
either
projector.
buy a new high-end receiver
Right.
that's capable of passing these
The new
latest,
standards,
yeah, right. Or
Like it says on it 4K ready and everything,
Yeah.
and it does pass 4K.
well, you're fortunate you had a Blu-ray player that had two HDMI
Yeah.
outs because that's not always the case.
Yeah. Well, it was like, why isn't this working?
Yeah,
I'm like, why isn't it It's supposed to be HDR, right? And then, yep,
yeah.
two cables.
And usually be blaming the cable.
I
Like,
did
oh,
initially.
Like this piece of
Yeah,
shit
I tried a
HDMI
different one. The problem is I have a 50-foot HDMI
geez.
cable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, that's another big factor. Luckily, it seems like somebody's actually on now. Linus over at Linus Tech Tips.
Oh yeah. They're
He's
testing.
actually going to be testing allegedly all these cables that say they are a standard. And as it turns out, it seems like a lot of cables don't meet the standards they claim to be, which is a big issue. Because you buy a cable and it says it's 1.4A or whatever, and if it doesn't actually do that, you have problems. You think it's supposed to be compatible, but
Although
it
I
doesn't
think they're
work.
finding out it's at the bottom basement bargain price range that really are
Well,
failing.
I guess
right?
we'll find out.
I mean, we're
He's
not
supposed to
talking.
check.
We're not talking to get go and spend hundreds of dollars on an HDMI cable, but you know, I thought they tested a bunch of them that were like
They did.
reasonable. And they were all pretty
Yeah,
much met the
generally
standard.
speaking, the cheap joint ones, they
Yeah.
don't work.
Yeah,
they don't do what they say
The
they're
sub
going to do.
$10 range is questionable.
And the trouble is
Any cable.
you get video, but they don't meet the standards they claim. So if you're buying the cable specifically because it needs to be this type of standard or whatever, it's an issue if it says it is, but it isn't.
Yeah.
I've ran into this as well.
Don't you need to look? What do you look for? You're looking for verified, tested, verified. That's what they call it. That.
Yeah, well,
But who
you don't
knows?
really know. That's the thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no good way to test that
Well,
You
yeah,
get a
need
cable
to-
other than
tester.
try it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could try it, see if it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, I ran into that before because when the new Apple TV came out and it ran Dolby Vision to certain TVs, it would have a test built in to the Apple TV to see if you can actually run Dolby Vision. And I had a cable laying around. I tried like 3 different cables and none of them worked, And so it's like, oh, I guess I need a new cable. And then I got a new cable, but it was longer than the 2-meter standard that they had for the new spec. And it went like, I'm like, uh-oh, I don't think it's going to work. And then it worked. And it's never did that since. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not like it figured it out. Or
Yeah,
anything.
I don't know what happened.
Apparently
but-
you figured it
and
out.
it's
Something figured something
never
out.
had a glitch, but
Yeah. Huh.
I was a little worried initially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd still be worried. I'd say that thing's on the hairy
No,
edge.
it's been working for like 2 years.
Oh,
now,
that's
so-
pretty good. Yeah. Don't sneeze.
Yeah, it's fine.
Don't move anything.
Oh, now it's a
one of
different
those-
TV.
It's like when they're doing a trade show, right? It's like there's things that are taboo to do at a trade show
Yeah.
because you don't want anything to quit. You know, you don't want anything to fit
Something like
in
that.
the middle of the show. You know, don't do that. Don't touch that. Turn that off at night.
Yeah. It's working now.
It's
Nobody
working.
changed
Don't,
anything.
yeah, someone's going to, hey, can you plug this in for me? I want to try. No, we can't. We're not touching the system. You know, it works. Anyway.
Well, unfortunately, audio is kind of still early days with all these new standards, and it seems since all these standards continue to change and evolve, nobody really has enough time to ensure that their product, their cable, their whatever, actually performs and works properly all the time. And it's a bit of an issue. You have an old cable, you plug it in, you think it's going to work. It says on it, it says standard, but it doesn't work.
And the thing is, people think in their mind it worked before.
It worked before, yeah.
And it was just working. So there's
Right.
nothing wrong with the cable. And they're right. But, you know.
I mean, that's the thing, though. In all these situations, it still worked. That's the thing.
Yeah.
It still put out video, you know.
Just not what it was supposed
right.
to.
It just
Right.
couldn't hit the higher limit.
Can you imagine how many people in the world are probably at that level where they don't realize that they're not getting the full benefit of their new flat screen?
Yeah, you plug
because
like
of
an
a cable.
8-year-old HDMI cable in.
Yeah.
And you got a picture. It
Yeah.
looks all right, you
Yeah.
know. And
The
then
picture will come out, yeah.
and you're adjusting it. And you're going, you thought you'd be more impressed with this new TV, and you're not.
I guess that's part of the factor,
You know?
though, because it's not like the
Who
old
would
days.
know?
It will work, probably. It just won't work properly.
Yeah.
And so you need to be the detective to figure out whether or not it's doing the
It's
right
kind
thing.
of like routers. I found out with a home router too. It's the same kind of thing, right? You every 3 to 5 years, you kind of really gotta. The cable, if you have a cable modem too, same thing. The cable modems become obsolete as
Everything gets
our
better,
bandwidth
yeah.
is increasing. You know, and you're wondering why 5 people in a house are having a problem with internet. Well, it's probably that $90 freaking internet router you bought. It works fine. You know, the Motorola cable modem works fine.
Yeah.
But for some reason, you're not getting what you expect out of your internet.
Well, the cable company's second question after is it plugged in, they ask you what you have
Yeah.
for hardware.
Right.
That's-
Yeah, because they know right away what its
Yeah.
limitations are.
Yep.
But yeah, those are the two things I noticed. I noticed that a lot in my house. Like 3 to 5 years is Steve, for cable modems and for routers. Routers may be a little longer if you get a good one.
Well, in pretty much anything that continues to evolve and improve, computers and technology especially, usually, things change fast. So you have a thing that you might not consider. You have an HDMI cable or something like that, and you might not recognize it could actually be a limitation. And some of them aren't even marked what standard they're supposed to be, and plenty of them apparently don't hit the standard. So I don't know how you know,
You gotta
but
try it.
that's an issue.
Yeah, and you got to know where to look on the screen
Yeah.
where the info where it tells you what the res is you're looking at.
Not all TVs do that.
and you got to know
sometimes
what
it's hard to
you gotta know what
find.
you're looking for too. Even if it tells you, you got to know the numbers.
That's the issue.
Yeah, so it is complicated, just like audio.
Mm.
It's just never ends.
Yeah, well, the first time I noticed it, the cable not being adequate, the cheaper one I got, I'm like, it got to that like blue screen, that's like the warning, whatever, copying this disc or whatever, and I'm like, this is 1080p, like instantly. I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, because the
and
text
then
looks like
yeah,
crap.
it's like, 1080p. I'm like,
Yeah.
something's wrong.
Yeah. Well,
But
I mean, there you have it. We tried to make this simple, but it's not.
There's no simple answer.
There's no simple answer to this.
Pretty much either just use USB and hope it works fine, or contact the manufacturer and ask them if they actually have a logical reason for why you would want to use
Well,
something
that's the
other
real.
than that.
That's the real thing. Is if you're not sure, seek professional help.
Yeah, and it depends on the gear.
It's always been like that.
Yeah,
always been
sometimes
like that.
these plugs are just slammed on it just to give it more compatibility. Other times they put a significant emphasis on a particular input, and that should be your priority to use that one. But it really depends on the gear. Right now, the standards are kind of too immature to make a sweeping recommendation.
Yep. So there you have it. There ain't none to make other than try it.
Unfortunately.
But
or
yeah.
stick with USB. You're probably good.
USB
Yeah,
probably.
USB. That's what I tell almost everybody. It's just, it's kind of like it's pretty much everything's made to work with that in high-end audio, and and if it don't work, consider yourself lucky, because now you get to figure out why,
Oh yeah.
Oh,
and that'll
fine.
solve the problem right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, once you figure out why it didn't work, then
Well, then you know all about it. You know what.
right. It's
You had to
actually
try.
yeah, right. That's true. It's a learning curve, like everything in audio.
Maybe it's intentional.
It's an
then.
educational process. Yes.
Okay.
You go, oh, that'll never trick me again, but it will.
Inevitably.
On that note, everyone, we got to get moving. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thumbs us up. Take care.